Hi. I want to return to the theme of conflicts of interest, and today talk about what I'll call institutional conflicts. These are conflicts that people encounter not because of an unfortunate situation that arises in the context of fulfilling their professional responsibilities, but by the very nature of those responsibilities themselves. Having that position automatically puts them in situations of a conflict of interest. Now, in most professions, we want to avoid conflicts of interest, and we think about various ways of resolving them if, unfortunately, we find ourselves in one. But in these professions, it's somewhat different. We still can think about institutional questions, but now they really are institutional questions. What happens is that the very nature of the job brings with it certain kinds of conflicts. And so I want to go through and look at a number of these and think in general about what we might do about this. In some cases, I think it's unavoidable. There is nothing to do about this. In other cases, well, maybe there are institutional ways of trying to at least remove some of the pressure and reduce the severity, at any rate, of conflicts of interest, even if we can't get rid of them entirely. What are some examples? Well, here's a prime one. People who are government officials. Bureaucrats, especially people who work in administrative agencies. But it can be true of Congress people too and other officials. But I want to focus here on people who are employed in administrative agencies, in the federal bureaucracies, for example, or in various state bureaucracies. These are positions that really have built into them certain kinds of conflicts of interest, at least at the managerial level. Professional responsibility of someone working in a government agency is to promote the public interest, to promote the general welfare. That's part of what it is to be a government official. However, in these cases, how does that person advance professionally? Well, we'd like to say it's because they do an outstanding job of serving the public interest, and sometimes that's true. But it's well known that within these agencies, the way you rise, the way you increase your power, increase your budgets, increase your staff, get more resources devoted to your department, is to, well, stress the importance of your department and make sure you do draw more resources. It is a commonplace that administrative agencies that are created to solve a problem almost always persist forever, long after that problem has become an issue at all. Why does that happen? Because the people within them have the preservation and expansion of their own power as a major goal. Indeed, there's an entire field of economics called public choice theory, which postulates that the best way to predict the behavior of government officials is not to think about the public interest or the general welfare, but to think about what their specific interests are. In short, people in these agencies professionally have, as a part of the job, really built into the structure of things, a conflict of interest. Their own interests are improved by expanding their power, expanding their budget, expanding their personnel, expanding the agency. But that suggests that government will grow and grow and grow. And presumably there's a size of government that is optimal for serving the public interest. But there is no particular limit to this. These people will seek an increase in power. And the more of them there are, you might think, the more people that we now have seeking increased budgets, increased power. So it suggests that government agencies of this kind tend to grow over time independently of any effect on the public interest. And indeed, that seems to be true. No one knows how many federal agencies, for example, there are right now. The best estimate is somewhere in the vicinity of 423, I think, but some people count about 300, some people count more. It's a sort of sad situation when nobody actually knows how many agencies there are. Many of these agencies are gigantic, having tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of employees. And they tend to pursue their own interests independently of any electoral results, independently of who is actually in charge of the legislative or executive branches, independently of judicial decisions in many cases, independently of what the voters want or need, in short, what the public interest actually is. So those kinds of bureaucracies are a prime turf, you might say, for these kinds of institutional conflicts. Now, it's actually slightly worse than this, because how do I get increased budgets, increased personnel, increased resources? I make the case that the problem is even more severe than people have been thinking. In short, I don't have an incentive to solve the problem my agency was created to solve. I have an incentive to make that problem worse, and to make that problem seem more severe than it is. So actually my incentives are to make the problem more severe and make it then seem even more severe than it's become. And both of those are dangerous things. The latter is going to mess with our ability to set reasonable priorities because we're getting a distorted view of how serious certain problems are. The second, of course, is instead of solving the problem, we're exacerbating the problem. And you can point to agency after agency and administrator after administrator whose job is supposedly to solve a certain problem. And in fact, everything they do makes that problem worse. But of course, that strongly serves their interests. The worse that problem becomes, the more they can say, see, I told you we need more resources, we need more people. And I see that happening around me all the time. A second example of this also involves administrative agencies of this kind, but is somewhat broader than that. Political scientists have talked about an iron triangle existing between regulatory agencies, regulated industries, and then legislative bodies that actually pass those regulations. There tends to be an iron triangle here simply because of the symbiotic relationships among, let's say, a legislative committee in charge of, for example, energy production, energy companies, and then a body that actually regulates energy companies like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Energy more broadly. Those are things that look like they are in opposition to one another, and sometimes they are. However, in addition to that triangle, we have various public interest groups that have a stake in, for example, energy policy or environmental policies and so on. And so, if anything, this has become more like an iron rectangle rather than an iron triangle. Now, why is this a problem? Well, for one thing, the regulatory agencies need a certain level of expertise. How do they get that expertise? In part by employing people who have been employed in the industry that's being regulated. Also, what's their best prospect for a job, having become an expert now in a certain kind of policy? Well, jobs in that industry. So we have what some people have called a revolving door, where personnel circulate from legislative committees to the industry that they are legislating about and studying, to the regulatory body that is supposed to be regulating them, and then perhaps to various nonprofit organizations and other public interest groups that have an interest in that. All of those make for the possibility of what people have called regulatory capture. The problem of regulatory capture has been a main focus of political scientists for the past 100 years or so. And the nature of the problem is this. There is a natural tendency for a regulatory body to become captured by the industry it's supposed to be regulating. What happens then is that it doesn't exercise very careful professional and objective oversight of that industry. Instead, what it tends to do, since it's most influenced by the big players in that industry, is to follow the interests of the largest companies in that. And their main interest is to keep out smaller competitors. So frequently, regulatory bodies tend to pass regulations that are actually not in the public interest, but in the interests of the large companies in the field they're regulating, a way of protecting them from competition. So what is supposed to be something that serves the general welfare ends up actually promoting the welfare of already the largest players in that field and working against the public interest by discouraging competition. Now, more recently, we've seen a different form of regulatory capture where the regulatory agencies are captured by a different sort of triangle, one where people go from the regulatory legislative committees to these nonprofit organizations and then to positions in the regulatory agency. And so sometimes the regulatory agency is following the interests of that particular nonprofit, that particular public interest group. But all too often those public interest groups really aren't promoting the public interest at all. They're promoting their own interests or the interests of a competing industry that would like to take business away from the existing industry and so on. So in short, regulatory agencies have a tendency to be captured either by the industry being regulated or by its enemies. And either way, they can't be trusted to promote the public interest. How do we prevent that? I think it's a very difficult thing to do. We'd like, ideally, to have some kind of oversight, some sort of watchman to watch the watchman. But how do you do that? Currently in the United States, there's very little judicial oversight. We have a doctrine that stems from a 1984 case involving Chevron. It's known as Chevron deference. And so almost always courts simply defer to the decisions of regulatory agencies and other administrative bodies. That means there really is no effective check on the power of the administrative state. And so when this sort of organization is captured, it's really almost impossible to override that capture. Something that would help a great deal is to have more effective oversight. By Congress, for example, require Congress to approve administrative decisions, or to, for example, say they are null and void unless specifically approved by Congress, perhaps to have more effective judicial oversight to throw out the doctrine of Chevron deference. High-level executives, whether they're in for-profit companies, non-profits, universities, hospitals, etc., also face a conflict of interest. They have an interest in accumulating power to themselves. Personally speaking, it's going to be better for their career. It gives them more power, gives them a greater status, gives them a claim to greater salary levels, and so on. But it's often not good for an institution to have decision-making centralized. In fact, often the decision-making is really best delegated to those who are closest to the problem. And that can happen in society at large as well, where government starts making decisions and applying them even on a national level or a state level, when really they'd be better off left to local officials and maybe even to private citizens. So there are incentives to centralize power, to centralize decision-making, even when that works against the public interest, and it would be better to have things decentralized. An extreme example of this concerns the Western Front in World War I. The commanding officers tended not to be in the trenches with the troops. They were stationed far behind. They had very little awareness of what was actually taking place. Time after time, they gave order to attack enemy positions, when they did not realize that every time this led to simply massive carnage. People were advancing out of the trenches across no man's land, across fields of barbed wire, facing enemy machine guns. They were mowed down by the thousands. That happened again and again, and the commanding officers had very little awareness of this. Decision-making was centralized, either with those command posts far from the front lines, or even worse, back in capitals like Berlin or London or Paris, where people had really a very misled impression of what was taking place on the front lines. Journalists kept reporting victory after victory, when in fact what was happening is mass and indiscriminate slaughter. And so people were making decisions on the basis of terrible information, who had very little contact with what was actually happening at the front. People on the front lines realized, and in many cases refused to follow orders, in some cases openly mutinied, because they realized that the decisions coming down from on top made no sense at all on the ground. That's something that I think happens in a lot of organizations, in less extreme forms, and luckily without tens of thousands of deaths on a given day as a result of it. But it often happens that people make a decision at the federal level that might make sense for New York City or Los Angeles, makes no sense at all in the middle of Wyoming or in a rural county in West Texas. And the same thing can happen within a company. The company establishes a policy that's fine for certain people in a certain division with whom those top executives have frequent contact, but makes no sense at all from the point of view of the average employee.